Greetings, fellow Empyreans. I am Ashtarothi, and this is a little bit of a discussion about the CSM, faction warfare, and the upcoming year. So, I have been doing a bunch of CSM chats where I sit down and talk to various members or candidates for the CSM, people who want to be on next year's CSM. For those of you who don't know, just really briefly, CSM is the Council of Stellar Management. They are an elected body of EVE players who basically represent us to CCP. They're flown out to Iceland. They are considered stakeholders on certain projects, and they are also held under NDA, so that way they're allowed to know information that we are not. So they're kind of our first line of defense against CCP's bad decisions. Alternatively, it also allows them to kind of collect information and know, have a filter to know what it is that we want and or need. And so traditionally, candidates will say what kind of thing they want to represent, either high sec or low sec or null sec. This year, we have an unusually high number of candidates who are saying that they want to be part of, represent faction warfare. And talking to them has caused me to realize that there is actually a fundamental problem with with faction warfare and CSM representation. So several years ago, about 3 years ago, I believe, Hans Jagerblitzen was elected to CSM predominantly because there was a major faction warfare change being happening. That major faction warfare change was the follow-up to Odyssey, which is kind of where we got the faction warfare system that we have today. During that transition, faction warfare went from a very offensively oriented system to a very defensively oriented system. It went from being about taking systems to being about holding systems. And that was a huge change to faction warfare and really shook up the balance. And like I said, Hans Jagerblitzen was our CSM representative at the time. Now we have come up to a time in which I believe that faction warfare is very, very close to being looked at again by CCP. We actually got some hints at what a faction warfare rebalance could look like as early as a year and a half ago. And so this is very much long overdue. Additionally, we have a new problem, which is that faction warfare actually has fundamentally changed in the last year, but without any consideration to faction warfare. Some people have argued that this change has destroyed faction warfare altogether. Other people argue that it's just a change in it. And that change was the introduction of citadels. Citadels undermine the faction warfare lockout systems. In faction warfare, you can take a system from your enemy which denies them rights to be able to dock, and therefore you're able to actually take a system, and then they can no longer operate out of that system. They have to fall back to another system in order to engage in incursions upon the now fallen system. What citadels have done is allowed you, if you manage to anchor a citadel, so if you manage to survive that 15-minute anchor timer, that means that you can have a citadel in a system for up to 2 weeks without actually being able to be taken down. And in faction warfare, 2 weeks is an incredibly long period of time. Basically, as we have proven time and time again, basically the biggest deciding factor to whether or not a siege is successful is whether or not your opponent, or whether or not the invader, has a structure in place. Now, this changes the nature of faction warfare, because faction warfare in general is designed around plex combat, which is smaller gang, smaller focus, smaller ships. And these citadel battles are more Apex-style forces who can bring the biggest, strongest force to any given fight. There are Apex mechanics already built into faction warfare, specifically the iHub bashes, where you do have to bring an Apex force. But those are less impactful and kind of more broadcasted, and more kind of in kind of the faction warfare vein than a citadel bash or fight. So, either way, the point of the matter is that faction warfare is incredibly active right now. It's a very lively place, and it is probably the place that has benefited the most from alpha clones, and the reason, arguably the most benefit, partially because arguably alpha clones are designed to be very functional within faction warfare. Based on the fact that plexes can allow you to decide what kind of enemy you have, the fact that you can decide whether or not you want to defend or run, the fact that you get paid to do small gang PvP. All these things make it really, really good for alphas. In addition, the whole racial lock thing kind of makes sense, because then you just join the militia of your race, and then that kind of, you fall into the mentality, and it works out. All that being said, obviously, there were not any faction warfare changes in regards to alpha clones when alphas came out, and at the time, I suspected that the reason why was because they wanted to get alphas into the program in order to figure out what does and doesn't need to be changed. Well, that's the point that we are at now. So the need for representation, the need for communication, the need for a good redesign is definitely there. But there is a huge problem when it comes to finding the perfect CSM candidate for faction warfare, which is that faction warfare is, first of all, split into two different war zones. There's the Amar Mimitar war zone and the Gallente Caldari war zone. The Gallente Caldari war zone has basically double the systems as the Amar Mimitar war zone. The Amar Mimitar, I think, has somewhere around 60. The Gallente Caldari have 120. What this means is that the war plays out differently in both regions, right? In the Mimitar Amar, it's way easier for some side to win. In the Gallente Caldari, it's much more about kind of front lines being pushed back and forth. But at any rate, different changes will affect one war zone over the other differently. In addition to that, unlike other representations, where, like, for instance, if we elect a CSM candidate for Nullsec who happens to be part of Pandemic Legion, I don't think anybody's confused by the fact that, like, that representative should be giving good representation to, say, the Imperium. In Faction Warfare's case, anyone who joins is inherently part of one of the two sides, and therefore eventually will have to give some sort of advice that will either support his side or be a detriment to his side. And so, at that time, that person is going to be expected to be able to give good advice, which is an incredibly hard thing to do. You may have to give recommendations that is literally contrary to your own personal efforts, which is a huge thing to ask from somebody. But even worse than that, arguably Hans Jagerblitzen, the last CSM representative of Faction Warfare, did a fairly decent job of this. He actually maintained Skype channels. He did all of the things that a lot of the CSM representatives say that they will do to be a Faction Warfare representative, by, like, trying to reach out across the aisle, trying to deal with other militias. He created a coalition of kind of high-tier militiamen to discuss what was going on and to give as much of an unbiased thing as possible. But even in spite of all of that, he was still accused of being unbalanced, to the point where several members of the Amar Empire actually undermined his efforts, because the notion was that him being a Mimitar was a detriment to the Amar. And any decision that even after the fact came out to be beneficial to the Mimitar, he would have to make an accounting for that, because people would say that he did it intentionally in order to help his own side. In fact, this got so bad that we actually got a term was coined, hand-exploiting, because he was accused of exploiting the acceleration gate mechanics. Obviously, it was discovered, or it was, came out to be that's not really an exploit. But the point was that his in-game enemies were actually, instead of helping him make more even decisions, were actually undermining his ability to represent us to CCP. So, this is the problem that we currently have. We stand at a point in which having good representation, having good information, having good feedback from the various militias is incredibly important. And at the same time, it's actually more and more difficult, due to entrenched animosities between the different militias, to actually get people to sit down and agree on things. In fact, actually, by its very nature, there are certain pieces of the war zone, or the war aspects, that will not get an agreement on. Just can't. So the question then becomes, what do we do about this? And I think that the solution is only partially solved by the CSM. There are some CSM members who have shown some pretty good desire to work with everybody. And there are actually some CSM members who have said that they want to be a faction warfare representative without actually being in faction warfare, so that they don't have a horse in the race. But the question then becomes, can they properly understand the troubles that faction warfare has? The need to find a good faction warfare representation is incredibly important this year. And it may be just something that we as faction warfare members will have to kind of come together and work together to try to make a more collective voice. I'm not really sure. But this is definitely something that's been bothering me and something I wanted to think about, and I wanted to pass it on to you guys. So in the comments below, please let me know. What do you think about faction warfare? Where is it at? Does it require representation? And do you think a single CSM member could possibly not only represent all 4 factions, but remain in the perception of representing all 4 factions? It's an interesting problem, and we're going to have to see how it develops in the months to come. This is Ash, out.